I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over, and we are starting the new year off. Actually, by the time you hear this, it'll be mid-January, but I'm starting off a new year of taping with someone I am wildly in love with his work. There's a poetry collection called Calling a Wolf a Wolf. There's Pilgrim Bell. There's a chapbook, Portrait of the Alcoholic. There is the Penguin Book of Spiritual Verse that he edited, and now a novel called Martyr with an exclamation point, and I hope that comes through when I say it because I love this book. I love this novel. Kaveh Akbar, it is really good to finally meet you. I have been living with your work for weeks and weeks and weeks now, and dude, you're the bomb. You're teaching at Iowa, you're the poetry editor for The Nation, and you are one of the funniest dudes out there. So
Wow.
can we talk about Martyr? Because there are going to be some people who look at this jacket and go, huh.
Yeah. I love the jacket so much,
I
but
do
it is sort
too.
of
It's amazing.
it's inscrutable in certain ways, and I love that. And thank you for that intro, by the way. I love this podcast. I love your mind. I love hearing your mind in action. It's a funny thing where, like, if you love Tess Gunty or you love, and a Napolitano, but like you spend an hour with them, but then you end up spending dozens of hours with you, right? So it's a really lucky thing.
Well, thank you for that. But seriously, let's talk about Martyr for a second, because you in earlier interviews, you've talked about how poetry either saved your life or made you a person. There's a lot that poetry has done for you. And yet here you are writing a novel. And it sort of changes the intimacy, right? Like poetry is all
Yeah.
about the interaction with the poet and the recipient, or the poet and whoever else that they're writing. It's a much more direct relationship. And even though you have a very tight cast in Martyr, and boy, do I like Cyrus. Boy, do I like that kid. But seriously, where did this book come from?
Yeah. Well, thank you for spending time with it, first of all, and thank you for saying you like Cyrus. I like him a lot too. I like everyone. But yeah, he's a messy, self-obsessed. I appreciate that because I think that, everyone talks about like unlikable narrators or whatever. And I don't know. I haven't met a lot of like wholly unlikable individuals in my life. So you see them in the world, right? But I've had forever this idea of an artist performing their own dying in a sort of Marina Abramovich artist is present kind of performance piece. And fiction is a place where you can just put such ideas into action without actually having to live them, right?
Yep.
You can kind of play out these thought experiments. So that was a precipitating nugget, a precipitating kernel. The Iranian culture of martyrdom, specifically Shia Islam, especially as it's practiced in Iran, and the way that the current regime sort of weaponizes the theological valences of the word has been interesting to me forever. Obviously, addiction and sobriety, recovery are major themes in the book, and those have personal, I've spoken about this at length. I'm a person in recovery, and so those have personal interest to me. And so figuring out a kind of narrative superstructure that would allow me to put all of those elements into conversation was a fun game. Like some people like Sudoku, and I like figuring out a way to put moving pieces or put my hands inside the sock puppets and make these pieces talk to each other.
And I really appreciate the way the pieces talk to each other, because you're cutting across time, right?
Mhm.
So we're in Iran right around late 70s, early 80s, when everything is kind of happening, right?
Mhm.
And then we're in the Midwest. And you're a
Mhm.
Midwesterner. I mean, yes, you were
I
born
am.
in Tehran, but you've been in the States since you were 2. I mean,
Yeah.
you're a Midwesterner.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've lived everywhere in the States, but I've spent the vast majority of my time in the States living somewhere in the American Midwest.
And yet there's this constant tension in the book, not just between the idea of being, in one place or the other, right? But you've got this kid who, spends not inconsiderable amount of time, shall we say, not sober, right? Like
Yeah.
while
Yeah.
he's figuring it out. But it's this constant pull between states, right?
Mhm.
Like it's the here, it's the now, it's the present, it's the
Oh,
past,
good.
it's the
Yeah.
present, it's the future. Like we're never just kind of sitting in one place, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So you've got to map this out, and you've gone, okay, yes, there is the palace, that very long, beautiful poem from Pilgrim Bell, where you were going back and like erasing a line and adding a line and constantly. And
Yeah.
I think it's the longest poem you've ever written, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of this stuff shows up, right? Okay, Keats doesn't show up, but I'm still laughing about that line. It's like I wanted to be Keats, and yet I've outlived him already by 6 years, and I'm like, who
Yeah.
really wants
Yeah.
to be Keats? What?
I would love to be.
Really?
I mean,
Okay.
100%. If I could write one poem a tenth as good as
Okay.
Nightingale, I would happily die at 27, 24, 20, 20. But I mean, this is intelligent minds can disagree, but
Okay.
you won't find me like passing over the opportunity to be Keats.
I mean, part of why I raise it is I've never formally studied poetry outside of like whatever they try and show you in high school,
Sure,
right? And
sure,
Thanatopsis is, I can't tell you a single line from Thanatopsis, but I
sure.
remember being forced to read it.
Yeah, well, that's why people don't. That's why people have this sort of acrimonious relationship towards poetry. I used to teach middle school, and we used to have to teach to the public testing, the state testing, and so we'd have to teach them how to look at a poem and say the moth in this poem represents A, the poet's mother, B, the poet's exile, C, and I've never written a poem that works that way. I've never particularly loved a poem that works that way. So yeah, it's like the way that I have had to teach poems because you want your students to excel at those state testing, right? It sort of denudes all joy from the experience.
But here's the thing though, as an adult, I've been able to come to poetry in an entirely new way because
Sure.
of poets like you, because of poets like Sophia Sinclair too, like Cannibal.
Sure.
I was
Yeah, I would
late to
say that a
Cannibal,
lot.
but wow, I love that collection so
Yeah,
much. And the
incredible.
things that you can do with language as a poet, right? That precision of language. And there's some, I mean, my copies of both of your books now are a little marked up. That's all I'm going to say.
That's
But
extraordinary. It's my
because
favorite sort of.
getting into the language, right, and being able to sit with the language and some of the stuff that you do, which you also do when you're writing prose,
Mhm.
but there's that precision of imagery that is so much fun. Like Philip Williams has a novel coming out too. Like there
Yeah,
are a lot of you doing
yeah.
these
We
really
walk among
and
you.
exactly. Tracy K. Smith had her new memoir. I mean,
Yeah,
all of these poets who are suddenly also saying, "Hey, I want to do both." And I
yeah.
love the idea of let's all do both kind of thing because the imagery is
The idea that you only live in one genre or the other is a very sort of new and very American one too. I mean, like Czesław Miłosz was writing
right.
novels and poetry, and I mean, like this idea that, I mean, Lucretius wrote The Nature of Things in verse, right? I mean, like he was writing a science treatise in verse, right? I mean, the idea that one can only live in a certain genre is not a particularly old one. There's no real reason for it other than it's like the convention of the past 100 years of American aesthetic thinking. There's no like contract that you have to sign when you get an MFA in poetry that says you'll only ever publish poetry.
You've been working though with poetry. I mean, you talk about how your mom has photos of poems you wrote when you were tiny.
Mhm. Mhm.
I mean, you've been doing this, like, this has sort of been in your DNA all
Yeah.
along. It was just a matter of whether or not you were going to turn it into your sort of bigger thing, right?
Yeah, or if I would survive to turn it into a bigger thing.
Well,
But
there's
yeah,
that.
it was pretty touch and go there for a while. But yeah, I mean, my brother is 7 years older than me, and he
Okay.
loved Legos and erector sets, and he loved putting those sorts of things together, and he understands what the pieces on a circuit board do, and he can say this is the transformer and this is
Mhm.
the capacitor, but I don't even know if those things are on a circuit board. But like the exact same way that he loved playing with Legos is how I love playing with language. Like truly, 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 like it is one to one. Like the exact same impulse. It's just he used his hands and I used like a pen or a paper. Like I it would be utterly nonsensical, but I just loved yoking things together. And then like sometimes I would see if I could make a machine out of it that did something, you know what I mean? Like tell the story or,
Right.
but I've never gotten over that. Like if I sit down right now, if you and I take like a 15-minute break from this
Right.
conversation and we just draft, we'll have produced something that would never otherwise exist in the history of mankind.
But if you think about it, machinery is a metaphor that works really well for novels and
Hmm.
poems and essays and songs, right? Like, I
Hmm.
mean, essentially, the mechanism for songwriting is not that different from writing poetry per se. Like, and in some cases, like if you're Jericho Brown, you might even invent a new form, right?
Sure,
Like,
sure, sure.
there's so many different things that can happen, and they're all built out of words. And I love the idea that momentum and silence seem to be two things that you genuinely care about
Yeah,
when you're working with words.
yeah.
And I flew through Martyr. I was actually really surprised at how quickly I went. I was like, am I speeding through this too quickly? And I really wanted to know what was going on. And I was very clear where I was. It's not
Mhm.
like I was trying to puzzle through. And, before we started taping, I told you this one thing that made me yell in the best possible way. I really still love being surprised. I
Yeah.
really walk into books that I read with this sort of sense of wonder or curiosity, whatever you want to describe it as, but
Yeah.
I love it
I
when I
do
get
too.
that
I do
moment. And I
too.
get to yell because it's so good because the writer did a cool thing.
I love that too. I mean, when I was writing Martyr, I was reading a lot of just, the old sort of like quarter mystery paperback kind of things, like
Oh,
just
the
figuring out,
pulps. Okay.
yeah, just figuring out like how to do breadcrumbs and how to like not overtell or not undertell
Yeah.
or, like how to get that calibration. I was thinking a lot about, I mean, this is not structurally a similar novel exactly, but I do want some of that propulsivity. In lyric poetry,
Hmm.
typically the propulsivity comes from rhythm. It comes from a rhythmic array of language. It comes from one syllable sounding out to the next, right? Whereas in fiction, it tends to be narrative, right? It tends to be like what happens, who's gonna say what next, right? This sort of thing. And that's really, really different. Like it's architectonically different. Like I think that in a lot of ways for me, poetry feels very akin to dance is maybe the closest to me, or
Okay.
statuary. And then prose feels a little bit further away. Like I think that you're right that poetry has some crossover with songwriting too, but songwriting gets to cheat with melody, right? Poetry can't
Right.
do melody.
Right.
Poetry doesn't. I mean, in an atonal language like English, at least, there's nothing quite like melody, right? And so prose felt very different. Fiction felt very different. So I was reading 2 novels a week and watching a movie a day the whole time I was working on this book, just trying to like foie gras duck narrative into myself. You know what I mean? Just like really stick the funnel in my mouth and like just shove the narrative down, right? Just to understand how people got through doorways in fiction, what people did with their hands while they're talking, how people paid for their meals, right? You know what I mean? Like just these little
Hmm.
things that like never even occur to you to be thinking about, right? When you're reading a book, they just seem so effortless, but if they're absent, you definitely notice it, right? The great prose stylists, the prose stylists that we all love, are great because that stuff just seems so organic. It seems so you don't even notice it. Whereas, when we feel that the language is starchy or we feel that the author is pushing the language instead of being pulled by it, it tends to be, and understanding how to do that was totally new. There's no, I mean, at least in my poetic education, there's no real equivalent to like describing how a character got the money to buy a plane ticket.
Or how the plane ticket is purchased, or because essentially every
Yeah,
single
yeah.
sentence in a novel should be moving the story forward.
That's what I'm saying. And
Right?
and
Like,
and
completely, like,
yeah,
every single sentence, and you have a
yeah,
little bit of luxury of space and time in a poem that you don't necessarily have with a novel, and I also I'll read novels where nothing happens. I will own that.
sure.
I'm perfect if the language is
Sure, sure,
there,
sure, sure.
I'm good.
Nicholson Baker is one of my favorite novelists.
Okay, so you know exactly what I'm
Yeah.
talking about because 'cause
Yeah.
you're just like, "What, dude,
Yeah.
are we ever?"
I
Okay.
just love watching his mind move. But that's not what this book is. That's not what I wanted to write.
Cyrus. He's not you, okay? Can we just say that? Because I have a feeling there are gonna be a
It's
lot of
funny.
reviews who are like, "Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, and this is p" and yeah, okay, it sounds like there might be some elements of your life. I mean, obviously,
Sure.
the recovery piece and,
Yeah.
the addiction piece, but, like, it is still fiction.
Yeah, yeah, it's a funny thing. I mean there's obvious autobiographical symmetry between our lives. So is there obvious autobiographical symmetry with my life and Orchidez's life, as like a public facing artist, right?
Mhm.
Oh, so Cyrus just writes poems for himself, right? There's
Right.
no and so like all of her discussion of being a public facing artist is as biographical as like Cyrus's war stories about his addict. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm happy to give the book to the world and the world can do what they want with
Mhm.
it. My hands are off of it at this point. But yeah, I mean, to reduce it to a purely autobiographical, this character is me, and all of these characters
Mhm.
are auxiliary to scaffold the one character who is me is it feels totally not how I thought of it, not how I think of it. It's also interesting that in the UK cover and the UK cover has a female figure on the cover,
Because
and the copy is all orbiting the artist, which is interesting because I think the second half of the book is largely more Orchidea centric, and the first half of the book is largely more Cyrus centric.
I love Orchida. I absolutely love the character. I love what we learn about her. She's so formidable in the best possible
Yeah. Oh, I
way.
love that word. That's such a
She's
good word
really
for her.
formidable. But you do a very cool thing with all of it. And there's another guy called Z. And there are other people throughout the book,
Mhm.
obviously, but those are sort of the three main people. And each of them has such a clear POV. And the way they connect or not is such a pleasure to read. It's
That's
it's
incredibly gratifying to hear.
it's rare to get this too. Like there are times where I'm looking for this and I don't necessarily get it, but
Mhm.
I'm just thinking too the way you cut back and forth between time and place and sort of as the characters reveal themselves to themselves kind of thing. Like
Yeah, yeah,
we're in on the joke and we're not.
yeah,
And it's a really hard high wire act to pull off. And Tommy Orange and Lauren Groff are part of how we got here. And I'm a
yeah.
huge fan of both of
Massive
them.
parts. Yeah, me too.
Huge, huge fan. But can we start with Tommy? Because I can see that I was obviously not there when the two of you met, but like knowing him to the extent that I know him and now having met you, I'm like, oh, I can imagine the whirlwind that
Yeah,
came out of the
yeah.
two of you meeting. But he had a copy of your first chapbook, Portrait of the Alcoholic. He came to the school where you were then teaching. You're now at Iowa,
Mhm.
but at the time you were somewhere else. And it sounds like the two of you just kind of he came to find you. He knew you were there. You didn't know he was coming to look for you.
I
And
didn't know. I mean, I knew it was coming, obviously,
yeah,
but I didn't know
to
he
speak,
had any
but
idea who I was.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. You then somehow end up working on your novel with him, and he's writing poems with the
Yeah,
characters from Wandering Stars. I would like more of this story, please.
yeah, yeah. I mean, you know a lot of it, which is amazing. But you really dug deep. But yeah. So he came to where I was then teaching
Mhm.
and brought a copy of my chapbook. So I was, understandably immediately endeared to him because it was like, this is not even like my first poetry book. This is like a chapbook that, not. I mean, it's available for sale, but it's not a huge, whatever. It's like a deeper cut,
I know because I
and
bought it. We have it.
I appreciate that. Well, everyone knows, anyone listening to this knows how exhaustively you research everything and how excited. I mean, I think that we're very simpatico and that we both really, really love the things that we like, But yeah, so Tommy and I hit it off, absolutely hit it off. And the end of that night when we met, I was back home and I
Mhm.
got an email from him with this poem that he had written that
Mhm.
night about a thing we were talking about. And so I stayed up and wrote him a poem back in response. And he was like, great, what are we writing about next? And then we just kept it going. I mean, I literally just sent him pages a couple of days ago and I have a new thing of his to read. We trade pages every Friday and send each other. He calls it band practice, like we're in a band. And he wrote Wandering Stars. It's both a sequel and have you read it yet?
I've read enough of it to know that I'm
Okay.
wildly in love with it.
And you're saving it for when you talk to them.
Let's put it this way, I have maybe 50 pages
Sure.
that I'm putting off because I don't want it to end.
Yeah, I'm
And
totally
that's the
understandable. Yeah.
biggest thing where it's just like, of course it's going to be brilliant because it's Tommy, and I
Yeah,
loved There There.
it is.
There There to me has the kinetic energy of a crime novel set in Los Angeles, even though
Yeah.
it is
Yeah.
about Oakland and powwows, and I'm a little more of a Los Angeles person than I am a San Francisco person,
Sure.
and, to have There as it exists in the world is pretty great as far as I'm
It's
concerned.
extraordinary,
Yeah.
and also I think that people miss, or I mean, I don't know, I haven't exhaustively metabolized the criticism around there, but it is absolutely a book of revolving characters that
Yeah.
culminates in this like grand scene at the end, and is brilliant in that way. But it's also like his prose is so good and sneaky that he can get away with putting in like a 3-page treatise about what he thinks of
Mhm.
death or a
Right.
three-page treatise about what he thinks about fatherhood,
Mhm.
right? And truly just like it could be like pulled almost like word for word out and just like set as like an essay, like Tommy
Mhm.
Orange on fatherhood.
Yep.
And but like because it's within this utterly intoxicating, enchanting prose, you don't even notice that he's getting away with just giving you like, here's what I think about this thing. You know what I mean? And
Mhm.
it's so exhilarating to see an artist do that. I mean, it's a philosophy book, like it's
Mhm.
like it is a guide to living as much as it is this narrative story. But because the narrative is so compelling and because you love those characters so much, you know, like who's going to forget Orville after they read that book, right?
Never.
That's what
No,
I'm
never.
saying, right? And so, and that is so good. I mean, I think that, you know, there are a trillion, gajillion big and small inheritances and thefts from Tommy's work. You know, he's read every page of this book 1,000 times over. You know,
Yeah,
like he's read draft after draft after draft after draft, right? Just as I have with Wandering Stars, right?
right.
We truly wrote these books together. You know, I think that idea of like using the narrative to also like be able to figure out a way to like just put a thought in the mouth of a character, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like this is the thing that I'm thinking about, so I'm going to put it in the mouth of a character, and then I'm going to put the opposite thought in the mouth of this character, so I have to really seriously consider it because, you know, like instead of just like dismissing it, you know what I mean? It's absolutely brilliant. Wandering Stars, I think, comes out early March,
Soon.
late February,
End of
and
February.
end of February, yeah, and it's a sequel and a prequel to There, and it's totally own thing. It's incredible.
But also, like the language, right? Like here you are riffing on friendship, riffing on your working relationship
Mhm.
with this guy whose work we both are absolutely crazy for.
Yeah,
But you are always bringing it back to the language. And that's the thing. Like, I've been ripped out of stories simply because I hit a clunker of a sentence and I'm like, oh,
sure,
I know what you
100% me
were
too.
trying to do. I understand what you were trying to do, but hey. And then I also sometimes read around the stuff that makes me a little crazy. I'm like, oh, okay,
Hmm.
the subplot is okay. Okay.
Yeah,
You know, we're just going to keep going through. So when I get the combination of great prose and story and characters that I'm invested in, and again, I don't have to like everyone. I happen to be
yeah,
very, very fond of Cyrus because he's very real. He's someone like, he's just, you don't always get to meet people like this in fiction, right? Like, there's always kind of a little something happening, and he's just who he is. It's kind of like young Mungo in that Douglas Stewart novel where
oh
you're just like,
wow.
oh, Mungo, oh, kid, you know,
That's an
but that
incredible comp. I love that.
but Mungo is really like that kid, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
everything about that kid. He's messy, he's complicated, he's really, really human. And that for me is the joy of dropping into someone's novel and being like, okay,
yeah.
show me what you have.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing sort of ethically hygienic or rhetorically hygienic about him. You know, which isn't to say he's like out
Right.
here just to like be a provocateur either, but he's just yeah, I mean, he feels very much to me like this sort of self-absorbed, self-obsessed person who endlessly reprocesses everything that happens
Mm-hmm.
to him, past and present,
Mm-hmm.
and you know is immobilized with decision anxiety and obsessing over the opportunity cost of every move that he
Mm-hmm.
makes in this life to the point of not being able to see the people who are right in front of him. I mean that feels very relatable to me. You know, again, I don't want to say this is like a autobiographical novel, but I mean certainly I can relate to those things.
One thing that surprised me though, as I was noodling around prepping for this show, is you said Lauren Groff
Hmm.
gave you some pretty hardcore feedback, but then also said,
Yeah,
hey, this
yeah,
is the
yeah.
way through. And I mean, obviously, I'm not asking you to tell me exactly what she said, but when
Sure.
you're working in a relationship like that with someone who obviously has I mean, Matrix,
Yeah.
there's so much of her work that I love, but
Oh
Matrix
my
made
God.
me
Yeah.
care about nuns, French nuns in the 12th century. And
Yeah.
now I just want to ride a horse through someone's front door.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really would like to do that. And
Listen,
all
keep your
because of
grades up. The day will come.
right? But also like the way she was marking time too, where
Yeah.
suddenly you had like it wasn't just it was a Tuesday in June 15 years later. It was
Hmm.
we went from having 8 nuns, 3 of whom were half dead and no plants and no vegetables and no
Hmm.
nothing to, 120 nuns and this business and that just
Hmm.
the markers for time were so well done.
Yeah.
And obviously, Vaster Wilds is I really love that book.
Yeah. I mean, she outbros all the survival fiction
Mhm.
bros. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
she's that scene where what is it? She like the character reaches into a squirrel's nest and pulls out the baby squirrel or the fluff from the squirrel to line into her shoes. I mean, there's stuff that like I don't know where you learn that that's a thing, you know, but she's just so utterly competent at whatever she's writing, whether she's writing about centuries old
Mhm.
European nuns or whether she's writing about, you know, survival novelist fiction that, I don't think that she's ever had to survive in the wilds off of squirrel fur, to warm herself, as far as I
Mm-mm.
know. And I feel like I know her pretty well, but the mind and the ferocity of the intelligence, I think that she and Eve Ewing, I don't know if you know the writer Eve
I
Ewing,
do.
but I
I
think
do.
that, yeah, I think that they
I mean,
might
I
be the
know her work,
two,
I should say, but
they might be like the two just straight up,
mhm.
literally smartest people that I know, just like straight up, and just ferociously competent.
But also she hands you notes and you listen.
Yeah, sorry, to get to
Not
the
every, but
actual,
here's the, but no, 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 because
I can just gush
sometimes,
about my friends for all
no, that's,
podcasts. Yeah.
please feel free.
Yeah.
I've done it before you. I will do it after you. You
Sure.
can still do it. But part of why I'm bringing it up, though, is knowing, a writer's work is very solitary, right? Yes, you
Hmm.
teach, and yes, you're an editor, and you're a huge champion for poetry. But at the same time, like, when do you know that maybe someone else does have an eye for the work that you might need because you're so deep in it and you're so
Yeah.
close to the
Well,
characters and everything else that you kind of have to go, maybe.
mhm. So, Lauren and I had a residency together.
Okay.
I was obviously there for poetry, but it was actually when I was working on this novel. And so, I mean, just early as sort of
Right.
compositionally, like just the fundamental features of it, she and I would take these long walks. And we were also, I think at the time, the only two Americans. It was a sort of international residency at Civitella. And we were the only two writers, importantly. Everyone else
Okay.
was, like a jazz saxophonist or a painter, like these
Right.
sorts of things. And so we would take these long walks, and I describe what I was thinking about in the novel, and she would be like, "Oh, that's interesting, but what if you made this person do?" You know what I mean? So like from that kind of like just real structural stuff to, and then, for months, she would say, "Send me a draft whenever you have," like really earnestly,
Yeah.
to the
Yeah.
point that I actually believed her, like, because
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
first couple, you're like, okay, you're being nice, whatever, but at a point I was like, all right, well, I mean, like if Lauren Groff asks to look at your novel, you don't thumb your nose at that opportunity, right? And I sent it to her, and she, within 48 hours, I mean, again, like I don't know, I think that she has like 4 more hours in her days than I have in mine, like hers are 28 hours long or something. I don't know how she does all that she does, because she does this, like one of the great things that I've learned in the process of, having now, written this novel is like she's touched everybody's. This is like her part-time hustle that she doesn't get paid for in anything but like karma, is just
Mm-hmm.
like she's touched everybody, like she's just helped so many students who can do her no good in any way, you know what I mean? Like she's touched so many people. And she constantly does this with people who can really bring her no professional whatever, like it's the most unmercenary goodness that you can imagine, right? But she has to just have more hours in her day than we do in ours, because I don't know how she does it. But anyways, I say this to say she turned it back to me in 48 hours,
Mm-hmm.
and she had eviscerated it. Like
Okay.
every page was like, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this
Mm-hmm.
doesn't work. This doesn't work because but like the margins were like as replete as the text on the page, And it's one of the greatest gifts that I've ever been given in my creative life, because it would have been so easy for her to say, "This is great, move this comma here and send it off." You know what I mean? And it would have been fine. Like it looked like a novel, it smelled like a novel, it tasted like a novel. You know what I mean? But it would have been a worse novel. I'm not saying like the novel now is some zenith of the form or whatever, but
Oh, I'll
it
say it.
certainly.
Oh, no, no, no. I'll say it. I'll say it.
Well,
I
it
know. I will
certainly.
own that. I will own that completely. Wait, wait, wait. You maybe don't want to say it because clearly, you have a different relationship to the text, but I'll simply say it. This is one of the best coming of age novels. But it's also, it's family, it's art, it's home, it's all of these things, right? That every single one of us thinks about. Maybe not every day, but like there is sort of a thrum of energy and
Yeah.
story running through Martyr that is so familiar. I mean, the way you write about art, it's like, well, all of those people, okay, who
Yeah.
think, yeah, it's no, no, no. I will say it. It's a great novel.
I
It's
wasn't
absolutely a great
fishing for
novel.
that, and it's
I
immensely
understand that.
gratifying to hear you say that. Truly, sincerely, that you picked up on, because I mean, it is. a novel about everything. You know what I mean? Like Alan Grossman said that a poem is about a thing the way a cat is about a house. You know, like a cat walks
Yeah.
about a, and I think that that's what, I think that's the best way to describe art. You know, like if you can reduce a piece of art to a certain
Mhm.
aboutness, it becomes a brochure. To get to the Lauren
Yeah.
point,
Yeah.
to say that it would have been so easy for her to just pass it on to me and
Yeah.
say, this is and someone, it would have been in the world in some capacity. Like it looked enough like a novel, but she gave me a blueprint and I didn't take every one of her notes, but I took most of, she's pretty good at what she does. And they were mostly really, really wise and smart and
Hmm.
sagacious and
Hmm.
generous. And I worked from that as my blueprint for 6 months. I mean, it was really just like I didn't need to show my agent. I didn't need to show,
Hmm.
like that was, and I rewrote, I radically revised, I rewrote, I tore away probably 40% of the novel and rewrote a lot of what remained. I mean, it was, again, I mean, I'm getting emotional talking about it because it's like, it was one of the great kindnesses that's ever been given to me. The faith that I would receive like real feedback and not
Hmm.
just like the sort of like fluffy, that she had that faith in my seriousness as an
Hmm.
artist, still just means the world to me.
But also, I can see the through line between the collections. Like, I can see the evolution
Oh,
of your
cool.
voice, starting with Portrait,
Yeah.
going to Calling a Wolf, because there's a little bit of overlap.
100%. Yeah. There are lines that recur and images that recur.
And then we get Pilgrim Bell, and I'm like, oh, oh, guys,
Mhm.
something shifted. And you have talked about it, and I am sort of, we're going to go there for a second, but
Please.
you get this big sort of psychic shift in your own life between
Mhm.
Calling a Wolf and Pilgrim Bell. And that sort of, to me, feels like that's where Martyr starts in the back
Yeah.
of your brain. If I'm
That's right.
if I have my timeline right. I mean,
That's right. You nailed it.
but there are some lines in both collections. I mean, like I said, I have destroyed both copies. It's very funny. I
That's
have a
incredible.
section of The Office where all of the books get, and people are like, "What is this?" And I'm like, "I'm a very active reader."
Yeah, you read like I read. Yeah, it's sort of like a whirlpool.
Yeah, it kind of is. But part of it is figuring out how the connective tissue works.
Hmm.
Right, and sometimes you're right, and
Yeah,
sometimes you're wrong, and sometimes the
yeah,
writer's like, "What are you talking about? I have no idea what you mean." But and it's nice to have the luxury, right, to sit with that kind of work. So in terms of, I mean, I know you're writing all the time. I
mhm,
know, you said you write stuff down so you don't forget. But in terms of the work and switching gears between pieces, and I'm talking about individual poems too. I mean, yes, there was the palace that you worked on for ages and ages and
sure.
ages,
But that
race
was the
and then
exception. Yeah.
yeah, but process. Like, it sounds like you're always just mentally taking notes. Like, there's nothing,
Yeah.
like, you're one of those people who's just like, "Oh, there's a thing."
Yeah. Well, and it's very mercenary. I mean, it's very like craven. Everything that I experience first. I've been thinking about the world as a writer for so long that everything that I experience comes in first through the filter of its utility to my writing. You know what I mean? Like that, like every image, every strange sentence that I hear, every unique formulation of thought, right? I'm like, "Ooh, like and I have literally thousands of pages of notes app. I have hundreds of notebooks around the house from the past decade because I'm
Okay.
totally unorganized. I'll just reach for whatever notebook is the closest notebook to my hand and just write the thing down in
Mhm.
it. And so
Mhm.
I've never experienced what people call writer's block because if I'm stuck, I just grab a thing and write down a phrase that I thought of 7 years ago or that I heard someone say into the phone 4 years ago, and then I'll connect it to the thing that I was writing. And then that ligature is the new writing. And then I can edit whatever I want, right? I've had project block. I've had like, this poem isn't going anywhere. Let me try to work on something else. Or but I've never had, because again, it's just the Legos. I have all of these Legos that I've hoarded, experiential Legos, the way that my cat over there is looking out the window right now. You can't see him, but the way that he's like peek looking out the window because we had our first big snow of the year, and so this is a sort of novel thing for him. Or like all of this is entering first through. Okay, well, that's a thing a cat could be doing in the background of some future story. That you know what I'm saying.
It's like the language is the starting point and the form comes later. Hello, cat. But language is the starting point for
100%. The
everything.
language is always the starting point, and the form, the idea even comes later. The aboutness comes later.
Have you had a chance to read Christina Sharp's Ordinary Notes?
Yeah, of course, of
Okay,
course.
okay. So you know what
Yeah,
I'm talking. You know where I'm going with this, but
yeah.
like the idea that some of the notes are a sentence long
Hmm.
and started life as a post-it,
Hmm.
and some of them are 7 pages. It's like
Yeah,
the
yeah.
words lead to the form, and then there's that piece where she
Exactly.
crowdsources book
Yeah,
recommendations from Twitter, but the way it flows, you're just like, oh, this is why we liked Twitter back in the day.
yeah. Remember when Twitter was fun?
I yeah. Yeah, it seems so long ago, but I
Hmm.
do think social media does sort of impact how we engage with literature in this day and
Oh,
age.
a
And I'm
hundred.
not
I mean,
just
in every
talking
way.
about book talk, but like
Yeah.
all sorts of different pieces. But the thing that I miss the most is sort of the serendipity and the discovery and the
Hmm.
accidents, right?
Hmm.
Like you can curate your life to a point where the algorithm shows you nothing you do not want to see.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that
yeah,
bums me out. Like in some ways it's great because then you discover a writer where you're like, oh, hi, where have you been? Or
yeah.
someone, pops in with a backlist
Of
title that I
course,
haven't thought about in 300 years. And I'm like,
of
oh,
course.
right. I loved that
Yeah.
book.
Can I tell you a funny story about that?
Yes, please.
When I was in this, I think it was early high school, we used to get the Sunday paper, just like the
Yeah.
local Sunday
Yeah.
paper,
Yeah.
and it had a Parade magazine in it. I don't know if you
Oh,
remember Parade magazine,
oh,
but
yes, I do.
yeah, and Parade magazine published one of these like 100 books to read before you die, or else you're
Right.
aesthetically bankrupt human being, or what. I don't,
Right.
the list without
Yeah.
without even
Yeah.
having to see it. It had like Wuthering Heights and
Mm-hmm.
Anna Karenina, and
Mm-hmm.
and I remember I was like, I'm going to read all these. And I went to the library and, I read a few of them. And then I remember going to get Don Quixote and I took it home and I read it and it was so bawdy and sexy and
Yep.
outrageous and weird and radical. And I took it back to the library and I was like, I need more by this person. How can I get more by this person? And only then, when I tried looking up the specific author's name, did I realize that I had gotten Kathy Acker's Don Quixote and not Cervantes's Don Quixote. And Kathy Acker, is this radical
Oh,
punk feminist,
yes,
and her Don Quixote,
is very,
Quixote
very different.
very different than Cervantes's Don Quixote. Hers is like this sort of genderqueer Quixote who sometimes is called Kathy Acker and sometimes is
Hmm.
called Catheter, and
Hmm.
it was a very,
Oh, I've
very
read
different
it. I
book.
know exactly what you're talking about. I have
Yeah, but
yet
again,
to
like that would
tackle.
never happen. That
Yeah,
would
yeah,
never happen
yeah.
in today because you would order it off Amazon or you would order it off your phone, and before you get to Kathy Acker's Don Quixote, you're going to have 70 copies of Cervantes's Don Quixote come up, right? And so like just and of that list, I mean, I probably made it through 15 or 20 of those books before I gave up on that project, but of that list, that's the one that I have the fondest memories of.
But I also would like to see us talk more about canon, as a culture, right? Like
Hmm.
canon needs to evolve the way language evolves, right? Language is meant to change. It's meant to be an
Yeah.
active thing. Reading is an active thing, right? Like it's not a passive, reading's not passive,
No, and the opportunity cost of it is massive today. The
right?
opportunity cost of reading a novel that takes you 10 hours to read has never been greater. You could use that to learn Bulgarian on Duolingo. You could use it to
Yeah.
learn how to julienne an onion. You could watch a season of Battlestar Galactica. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like
yeah, completely.
the opportunity cost, the availability of
Hmm.
alternatives to reading for 10 hours has never been more extensive, right?
Right.
And the way for literature to win isn't to impress upon everyone like that it's your duty to read, like it's like eating your vegetables,
Oh, yeah, eating your cultural vegetables.
yeah,
Like I've actually
yeah.
had people say to me, "Well, I just don't like to read." And I'm like, "Well, I'm
Yeah,
sorry. What am I supposed to say?" Like, I'm
yeah, and
sorry.
that's fine. I mean, like
You're
my
missing
brother,
out.
yeah, my brother is the most contented,
Yeah, yeah.
well-adjusted person that I know. Like truly,
Yeah.
he's got a good life, loves being a dad,
Hmm.
sweetest human being, like just a bastion of goodness in every direction, like just simple, clean, uncomplicated goodness. Hasn't read a book since he was assigned one in high school, and is perfectly content and lives
Yep.
like an ethically rigorous life, and it's fine. It doesn't cost
Yeah.
me anything. It doesn't.
Yeah.
He's not taking food out of my mouth to not.
Nope.
He likes movies and he likes learning about city infrastructure, and skyscrapers, and that's
Right.
what does it for him. And that's dope. But I like books, and I like talking back to the books that have spoken to me.
And that's talking back to the books, right? Like
Hmm.
talking about characters as if they were real
Yeah.
3D kind of living, breathing kind of extensions. I get so much from great books, and I get enough from books that are like, okay, I get why you exist. I'm
Yeah.
down. I do honestly believe that there's a book for everyone. Like, I
Yeah, I
genuinely
do too.
believe that. But at the same time, like, when I get the thing that makes my eyes get really big,
Mhm.
all I want to do is yell about it and just be
I
like,
know.
everyone
Well, we
needs
have
to
that
read this
same sort
book,
of like
right? Like,
evangelical impulse with this
yeah, yeah,
stuff
yeah.
too. Is like if I consume something that brings me this much joy, it would be almost like unethical for me to hoard that. You know what I mean? For me to just hold it to myself when I could be sharing that joy with the people that I love.
But also the things that I connect with, right? Like,
Yeah,
I spent a couple years in Chicago. It was fine. I'm meant to live on a coast. That's Some of
sure,
us are just built to live on a coast.
sure.
But there's so much in Martyr that I was like, oh yeah. And not just because I lived in Chicago for a couple of
Sure.
years. And I think that is so hugely important that I can look at this novel and be like, oh yeah, oh yeah, okay, okay, please get out of the back of my brain.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah.
do like the music and the messiness and being young and trying to figure it all out. And,
Mhm.
Cyrus has some challenges that maybe some other people don't have, but you write about class, you
But
write about
everyone does. I mean,
access.
Cyrus is one unprecedented
Yeah,
experience amidst 8 billion.
but he's so alive on the page. And that's the thing that I really appreciate because you watch him make these mistakes and you're like, okay, okay. Open the door before you walk through it, buddy.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we all have that person in our lives, and
Hmm.
sometimes that person has been us, and
Yeah,
but there is a joy in this book. And it's a joy that's not dissimilar actually to Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah's Chain Gang All-Stars. There's a
I love
joy
that.
in the prose.
Yeah,
And yeah, he's talking about abolition, he's talking about
yeah.
incarceration, he's talking about really complicated stuff. And you've got some complicated stuff in this novel as
Hmm.
well, but like we can't leave out the joy,
Yeah, I love that. I love
right?
that. I
You
mean, I
can't
hope
leave
that
it out.
when there is laughter, it's laughter made wise by having known real grief.
Yeah.
And when there is grief, it is made wise by having known real joy. I don't think that life has often given me any monolithic emotions
Mhm.
that if I'm looking, I can be in a certain sort of psychopathology that will only allow me to
Mhm.
experience, one facet, right? But
Yeah, yeah.
looking at any situation, right, the grief that you're feeling is ultimately the inverse of the amount of joy that that person gave you or the amount of joy that that person might have given you, right? Or the joy that you're feeling is because you know that such states are not constant, right?
Right.
Joy is, and I think Ross Gay is a great poet of this. People talk
Yeah,
about
yeah.
him as someone who just writes about gratitude or someone who just writes about joy. And he does write about those things, but there's always like death sitting in a chair in the corner of the poem or in the corner of the little prose vignette. Or there's always history, or
Mhm.
it's always joy made wise by its knowledge of what's not joy.
And you have this line in the introduction you wrote to this Penguin Book of Spiritual Verse where you're talking about, and I'm paraphrasing you slightly, but rage is a form of tenderness.
Yeah.
And that just kind of stopped me dead in my tracks. I was like, okay, hold on. Hold
I
on.
mean,
I
if
need to
you
sit
have
with this for a second. But it's actually kind of true. And it goes right back into what you were just saying, though, about joy and grief and joy and
Yeah, I
grief.
mean, if you've calibrated your compassion enough that you can feel compassion for people who aren't you, for people who you'll
Mhm.
never know, and then you hear that they're being murdered, right, in Gaza
Mhm.
or Congo or Sudan or Ukraine, right? The rage that you feel emerges from a surfeit of compassion, right? It's an ability to perceive their interiority as real, right? As humans, right? And I don't think that that's like a spiritual defect to be buffed out.
Right.
The presence of rage indicates that your spiritual apparatus is well calibrated.
Reading allows us to be part of the world,
Hmm.
right? Like it
Hmm.
just allows us to be part of the world. And then you get these great cut glass sentences that you throw around, and it's so good.
Yeah. Well, and they take you back into that, right? Like you
Yep.
have these sentences that are like portals of
Mhm.
that revelation that you had, of that glimpse into the unprecedented experience. Like there's There's a line in Morrison where she talks about a person's face looking like a shattered crystal ball, right? And I mean, I just will never forget the way that made me feel when the first time I read it. Or like Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, when he says, speaking indifferently to us who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices, right? That's an encounter with the consciousness of a child in Detroit in the first half of the 20th century. Not completely unlike my own consciousness, right? But I'm brought back to it through that little prism.
I'm going to build off of that for a second, quoting you. Cyrus has a dream. There's a series of dreams in the novel.
Yeah, which you're not supposed to do.
Yeah, but they're really well done, so we're just going to let you have all of them.
I appreciate it.
But there's a line that he has where, the dreaming starts not because he's trying to put context around events of his life, but that he's actually trying to remove the need for context. And that, when I think about what you've done in this book, right, where you're playing dream states, not dream states, sober, not sober, alive, dead, time, all of these things that you're sort of playing, because you are playing. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
It always comes back to grief, but you are playing throughout.
I love that word for it. Yeah, they're the Legos.
I got to feel everything, but to have all of that range of emotion and still be left smiling when I think about this book.
Yeah.
And it is exactly how I felt about Chain Gang All-Stars too. I mean, it's how
me
I
too.
felt about There. It's like, I cannot believe I'm smiling after all of this. But when you feel the energy of the prose, and when I think about the characters, when I think about what you've done creating this world, right? Like I've said it before in the show, like world building is not a phrase that we should only give over to genre fiction or like you actually just have to do that if you're writing a novel. Like you just have to 100%. Do it. It doesn't matter if you're standing in a kitchen in Pasadena in 1950, you have to build it.
Especially if you're standing in a kitchen in Pasadena in 1950, because we think we know what that kitchen looks like. So not only do you have to create that kitchen for us, but you also have to dismantle the kitchen that we have in our brains.
Right. And you dismantle quite a lot with this kid. No, you do. I mean, I'm really looking forward to lots of folks getting their hands on Martyr with an exclamation point and meeting Cyrus, because I think he's a really important kid. All right, you and I could keep going for hours and hours and hours, so I think we should do a live event when the paperback comes out, but that's a whole different thing. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to say thank you, Kaveh Akbar. Martyr is amazing. Calling a Wolf is amazing. Pilgrim Bell, I'm hoping that people come to the poetry as well as the novel, but Martyr is out now. It is a riot. It is so good and so smart and so... It's all of the things you want in a novel. So thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over.
This has been a sincere honor. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.